Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb.
And I'm Becky Scherr.
Throughout our time doing this podcast, we've aimed to speak to a variety of people with a variety of backgrounds, and today's certainly highlights that. We're coming to you with another bonus episode featuring our guest, Will Marshall. Will is the president and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute. The PPI serves to connect ideas and political action and maintains a close relationship with the Democrats in Congress, as well as leading governors and a host of dynamic mayors and metro leaders. Today, we're going to break down two recent op-eds Will authored in The Hill. First, why working families aren't sold on Biden economics, and Democrats need a post-populist economics, and get into this and the Institute's stance when it comes to tech issues and policy. We'll break down the dynamics of the 2024 cycle and Will's take on what a winning message looks like for working families. Thanks for joining us for the second time this week, and we hope you enjoy the show. We're excited today to be joined by Will Marshall, who's the president and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute. Will, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michael.
Tell our listeners a bit about what the Progressive Policy Institute is.
PPI is a think tank that's been around for about just over 30 years. We earned our spurs working with Bill Clinton back in the day to help him change the direction of the Democratic Party under the so-called New Democrats. And, after that, we had a lot of success in the 90s. After that, we had some rougher patches, but we're still at it, plugging away and trying to help, Democrats build bigger majorities and around a kind of radically pragmatic approach to governing.
What's the importance of being radically pragmatic in this political environment?
Well, in this environment, everybody, as we know, is very polarized, and both parties have really moved to their extremes. In fact, there's a new poll out I was just looking at that said most Americans believe both parties have moved too far to the right and left, respectively. And so, what we're saying is that's a great formula if you want to be a 48% party. You don't want to have a durable governing majority. You want to oscillate in and out of power every 2 years. It's sort of the recent pattern. I think one party grabs the House or the Senate, vice versa. The White House has changed hands repeatedly too. And so, our argument is that we need a realignment in politics, which means the kind of policies that could really command majority assent around the country. And if you look at the map, you guys know this, but Democrats aren't competitive in very broad swaths of America anymore. Rural areas, the middle of the country, anywhere outside the big metros. And we think that's a problem. Well, there's some other folks in the party that don't, but we do. And so we want to change that and make the party competitive where it isn't.
So here in Minnesota, we that is certainly is the case, right? We have Republicans tend to represent the rural greater Minnesota. Democrats have a stronghold on the Twin Cities metro suburban areas. Now, we might have fundamental disagreements of that sort of thing, but explain a little bit of what either you've done in the past or what you believe your appeal is to working Minnesotans, rural Minnesotans, or Americans, right? Not just Minnesotans, but in general.
Well, let me try to answer that question, Becky. We've offered a little bit of context about the changes that have happened in the Democratic Party since 2000, basically in this century. The party's moved pretty far to the left in a lot of respects. That's mostly because of young voters. We just had a young, the millennials and the Generation Zers after them have just grown up in a much more left-leaning political world, and they've moved the party substantially to the left. Our problem as a party is that the country as a whole has not moved to the left. And so there's a disconnection there that we're trying to deal with. I'd say it has a couple of key elements. One is on the economy. We believe that Democrats need to offer a hopeful vision of America's economic future, one that understands that none of us are going to do well if our private economy is not doing well, if it's not dynamic, if it's not competitive, if it's not innovating rapidly. And so we've heard, particularly on the left wing of our party, a lot of, just I'll be blunt about it, a lot of business bashing, sort of how terrible the private sector is. We think that's a mistake. There's some bad actors out there, and when they break bad, they ought to be punished. But in general, what we need is a partnership between a smart government and a private sector for prosperity, one that's going to create a lot of good jobs. It's going to lift wages, going to protect workers, and create a whole lot of new pathways to upward mobility. That's what we're about, and we're very much focused on this competition with China. We've got to win the battle for technological and economic leadership in this century. We're not going to do that so the public sector and the private sector are at swords points. We need to work together. So that's a distinguishing characteristic of our brand of radically pragmatic Democrats. The second one has to do with cultural issues. I don't have to tell you all that it's become very hot in American politics. The culture wars that seem to seep into everything now. And, frankly, I think both parties have problems on these issues, but the Democrats' problem is that, on issues like immigration, on crime, on education, on race and gender kind of issues, some of the party's positions seem to be pretty far from the sort of the median voter in the country. And so we have to practice cultural moderation, kind of an embrace of mainstream values. We're going to get a wider audience, in the kind of places you're talking about, the kind of places that used to vote, that used to be Democratic strongholds, but they're now deep red when you're.
So, listening to what you were just kind of describing there, explain to me and to our listeners how that's not maybe exactly what the Republican Party does in these areas, right? You talked about Main Street values. You talked about an experienced workforce with upward mobility. I mean, to me, I'm hearing all of these things and I'm like, I agree. And I'm not necessarily wouldn't probably be the key audience for a progressive policy institute here. So explain to me maybe that difference of how you differentiate still being part of the Democrat Party or, a moderate Democrat in that.
Yeah. Well, look, let me just say that doing at PPI, Progressive Policy Institute, which I run, we've always been willing to, cross the aisle and get into a constructive dialogue with Republicans of what I'll say the pre-Trump era, because they were reasonable people you could deal with. No longer the case, and just watch the antics of the Freedom Caucus in the House, where their cultural agenda is frankly just over the top. It's crazy. Mm-hmm. And so there's no way in the world that we're proposing that, but we're simply saying, look, on immigration, for example, we can't have uncontrolled immigration. We got to have controls. Our laws have to be enforced. We want to see more legal immigration and less illegal immigration. We're not for open borders, but we're also not for the kind of, restrictionist policies that the hardcore of the right are now pushing. So I don't think there's any trouble distinguishing what we are talking about from Republicans in general, certainly not from the Trump Republicans. On the economy, we're free traders. Trump is, he loves his tariffs. And also, the kind of populists and certain populists who are bashers of the private sector, they're one of the leading advocates for breaking up these big tech companies, which they claim are biased against conservatives. Which I don't really think it's true, but that's what they say. And so, look, when I talk about radical pragmatism, I really think that pragmatism is the radical option in a country that is far tilted to the right as America. And I know that there's some good folks on the Republican side here and elsewhere around the country that are trying to rebuild a kind of center right that's reasonable, governed in a way that doesn't split or doesn't divide, especially as the populist right person.
I completely agree. I think that's exactly what Michael and I have been striving to do here with this podcast, is to
Absolutely
give a platform or some more voice to kind of, we struggle with how to define it, right? It's not the middle in the grand scheme of the middle, but it's just not, like you mentioned, the pre-Trump Republicans. That's where neither of us are Trump supporters. We still tend to find ourselves in the Republican Party in some, facet of that spectrum, but it is tough.
Very tough. And look, I mean, I know a lot of homeless Republicans here.
That's my term.
That's what he tells himself every day.
Myself all the time, a homeless Republican.
I tell them come on over, but most of them aren't quite ready for that.
Yeah.
Well, because I don't like to miss an opportunity. Michael did endorse our Democrat governor for his second term. So, he's closer to probably coming on over than I am. But, some of the things you mentioned are, what we've seen from you, 2 recent op-eds that you wrote for The Hill. I want to kind of break down that a little bit. The first one is titled "Why Working Families Aren't Sold on Bidenomics." And I think a lot of great points. You mentioned the Trump tariffs. You mentioned the different, some of the things of reframing the economic policy and structure, but not necessarily leaning fully into what President Biden and his folks are selling. So explain a little bit about your stance on that and where you think work needs to be done.
Sure. Well, I wrote that column because the White House was touting, Bidenomics as a new economic theory, which maybe so, but maybe it's just the Biden economic policies of fast over the last couple of years. But in any event, whether it rises to the level of full-blown economic theory or not, the problem is, and look, I want to say that Joe Biden's done a lot of great things. The infrastructure bill was a great achievement. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically mostly a clean energy investment act, I think that's a pretty big achievement. And I think the CHIPS bill is a good thing. Although, we'll see whether the foray into industrial policy works or not. But I'm willing to give it a shot to see if it does. So there's some very good things there. But the problem is what the White House wants to say. Hey, all these things we've done are making your life better, but a lot of voters aren't feeling that. And only 30% of the voters in polls say that, that the economy's good. And, I don't think it's as bad as they think it is, but they have real reasons for not feeling better about their economic prospects. And the biggest reason is inflation. For all the, it's gone down, but it's still about core inflation's almost 5%. And that means if you get even a nice raise, 3-4%, let's say you got a good raise, inflation just eat it up. So a lot of families are feeling the pinch of inflation. They're feeling that their disposable income is being gouged by high prices for everything. Housing's out of control, food's pretty high, energy goes up and down. So they're feeling a lot of stress in the here and now. And so when people come and say, look, we've got all this infrastructure money coming down the pike, and we got all this clean energy transition, all the green jobs we're going to create for you, that hadn't materialized yet. So there's a sense that, well, are you really understanding the pressures that my family's under day in and day out? But that was the point of that article. I think, and I think Democrats do understand the inflation problem, but we got to also make it clear to folks that we're on the case. We're fighting it. We got a policy that is helping the Fed, which has the main responsibility to do its job. It's a tight fiscal policy, doing other things like lifting these tariffs that raise the price of your agricultural goods, that raise the price of a lot of goods. And so raise the price of imports and thereby contribute to inflation. So the things we could be doing that we're not doing, I think make a stronger argument to people that we're trying to get on top of the inflation that's really vexing American families. And then you'll have an easier sell for these other programs, the benefits of which haven't quite been felt yet, but I do think will be felt as we go along. And frankly, as we head into next year's election campaign, I'm hoping that people will see those new plants go up, those electric cars being sold. They'll see some of the changes that are in the works, and they'll feel better about the economy, but we're not just not there yet.
Before we move on to your next op-ed, I did want to highlight one part of this op-ed that really stood out to me. Michael and I are both come from a communications background in different facets of Republican politics, campaigning, government, all of that sort. And we've strongly talked about the need to talk to suburban voters and namely suburban women voters. You have a line in here that says the people Biden needs to persuade aren't progressive activists, but the swing voters who will decide the next election. Suburban independents and moderates repelled by GOP extremism. And it goes on. Can you speak a little bit to maybe what your institute or your general views on what kind of policies you guys are working or efforts you're taking to speak to the suburban voters that we know are the decision makers here?
Right. Well, look, that's a great question. And, what's really happened is a lot of independent moderate voters, they broke for Biden in 2020, particularly independents, well, both independents and moderates, and they broke for the Democrats in those contested swing state Senate races in 2022, which helped keep the Senate in Democratic hands. And so I think Republicans have a problem with those voters. They from the last two elections, they just have, and I do think that they look at Trump and see chaos and division and strife and, frankly, a crazy theory of a stolen election, and so they find it hard to be for them, particularly those frankly, that are college educated. Trump's strength, of course, it continues to be the non-college, white working class voters. But he's lost a lot of ground with college-educated voters, including college-educated suburban Republicans. So I think they're going to be a really big factor in the next presidential election if Democrats can. And I think one of the good news for Joe Biden is that he's seen as more moderate than the Democratic Party as a whole. I talked about this poll just a while ago in which the voters say both parties have moved too far toward their respective extremes, but they see Biden as more moderate than the Democratic Party, and that's a huge advantage that he has in the matchup with Donald Trump. If that's what we have to endure again next year, God, I hope not. But in any case, so what are those voters? Well, first of all, they want normal politics. They don't want crazy, you're the enemy, you must be destroyed. They don't want the kind of the incitements to violence they hear from from extremists, both sides. They want a normal politics that can help them solve problems, not a war. And so that's really important. And so a kind of temperamental moderation. I don't mean a political one where you're trying to split the difference on every issue, but where you don't view your opponents as enemies, right? But as people, that the Constitution, our system says you got to work with. You're not going to get anything done in government if you say, I'm never going to sit down with the other party and try to hammer out accommodations and compromises. Our system is built for those. We're not doing that. That's one of the reasons people are so frustrated with government. So making government work, being moderate in the way you talk to the other side and respectful, not trying to polarize around, the hottest and most incendiary issues of race and things like that. Those are big keys. And frankly, on our part, to make it clear that you're for growth and investment and innovation, and not just for heavy-handed regulation of the private sector and punishing capitalism.
Fantastic. Well put.
Fantastic.
I do want to go. You had a second op-ed from earlier this spring titled "Democrats Need a Post-Populist Economics." Explain a little bit maybe about what that means and some of the details you laid out in this op-ed.
Yeah, thanks. What I've noticed, Becky, and I, unfortunately, I've been around a little too long, maybe. But what I noticed is that since 2010, since the big, housing crisis / financial meltdown, a kind of state of clinical depression has hung over America when it comes to the economy. People are just really pessimistic, and that's not the normal state in America. The country I grew up in was kind of almost comically, hopeful and optimistic about the future. We always thought things were going to be getting better. Doesn't seem to be the way people think since 2010, at least where the economy is concerned. And, and I think, that's a kind of a populist hangover. We felt that the system failed. Both sides did. You had the Tea Party on the right, you had the Occupy types on the left. So you had a lot of people that feel like the whole system broke down, and all this talk about we're in post-capitalist America and all this stuff. And, we just stopped talking about how, we stopped trying to instill confidence in people that the future could be better for them. We played on their fears. And so I think we're still in that mode, and we got to break out of it. We got it. And that's one reason I like the fact that President Biden has talked a lot about this competition with China. I mean, the Chinese, unlike the Russians were an ideological rival to America, but they were kind of, they were hopeless when it came to running a decent growing economy. Chinese, not the case. They're totalitarians with a great economy. And so we got to raise our game as a country. They are investing big time in 5G and AI, electric cars and everything else. And they're going to surpass us if we don't deliberately and consciously focus on out competing them and out innovating them. So to me, that, we need to excite the country about something. And I would say that this competition with China, not to stir up an enemies kind of context, but to say, look, this is, Americans love competition, right? You don't want to go to the NBA final and watch some bunch of, saps come out there and get killed by 40 points, right? You want a game, you want a match.
Yep.
And that's what we got, whether we want it or not, with China. And so we ought to be talking about how we're going to win, talking about the policies going to help us win, and how we're going to make sure this time that working class people, non-college workers, people without college degrees, have a shot at getting the new jobs. And see, this is where I part company with some folks on the Democratic side, and really with Trump. There's a lot of nostalgia for the factory economy, but that old economy is not coming back. And, right now, if you look at where all the jobs are being created, it's e-commerce, it's digital, it's the digital sector, fulfillment and, all kinds of tech-oriented jobs, cybersecurity specialists. And these are good jobs. Not all of them require college degrees. And so we got to steer people into the new growth sectors of the economy with the skills they need to get good middle-class incomes and solid job prospects. So that's what we're focused on, PPI. We're doing a lot of work on apprenticeship, a lot of work on a much more dynamic way of making sure that that non-college people get affordable and quick access to skills they need to be upwardly mobile. And frankly, we've been critical of the big emphasis on, sort of student loan forgiveness, college going students. Nothing wrong with college going folk, but there's just been such a disparity of investment. The government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on the folks that go to college, and it spends a pittance on the folks that aren't going to college. We think that's an inequity that we ought to be, addressing as Democrats, particularly. So that's what I think. We've got to restore a sense of optimism about the future, a sense of possibility. We got to give people a picture of how America wins in this momentous competition with China. And rather than just tell them how bad they got it, that they're victims of global capitalism and the game is rigged against them and all that kind of stuff. We've done that for more than a decade, and now it's time to give people some hope.
I want to dial down a little bit about a subject you kind of touched on in your last answer about tech companies. There's some beyond congressional action. What are some of your thoughts on the near, what I would venture to say, near kind of constant litigation against tech company that's going on right now, and the impact they could have on our economy and development and growth in a number of sectors?
Yeah, well, we've PPI, one of our trademark, our signatures, if you will, down the years, has been we've been really attentive to innovation. And we watched as the internet economy got born, in Silicon Valley back there in the 90s. And we watched as Bill Clinton very intelligently took a light-handed approach to regulating these new sectors so they grow and flourish. and not jumping ahead of things, trying to regulate before you needed to, before a real problem started to materialize. But now we've had this kind of techlash, they call it, this backlash against the tech companies because they are big and huge. They're powerful, and there's no question about that. They've gotten very big, but most Americans like what what they've been providing us. We're talking here on a virtual conversation,
Yeah.
and during the pandemic, everybody shopped online, and and everybody's got a smartphone, and so people like what they've been getting from this sector. By and large, it's popular. The products, services are popular, and they're also cheap. And yet there is a contingent in Congress that's bipartisan. You've got right-wing populists and left-wing populists who want to break these companies up. Now, I'm not going to say they're perfect. There are abuses out there, and they, where they happen, we want to see public action. We want to see intervention. We want to, if regulations are necessary, fine. But the idea that our most successful and innovative and dynamic companies, which we're going to need to beat China in this tech competition, the idea that they should be broken up right now just doesn't make any sense to us.
Sure.
So we're saying make a case, show us where the harm is, and then we can talk. But the funny thing about the tech sector, and our economist Michael Mandel has documented this in several reports. Prices are low. In fact, they range from free to low. What do you pay for, search online? You don't pay anything. So this is not a high cost sector. On the contrary, and it's actually subtracting from inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy right now. Now, as I mentioned, so on the left, you've got this idea that they're just too powerful and they got too much money and they buy political influence and they call the shots. I think that's not true, but they are powerful. There's no question about it. But I don't think they've got that much ability. But you've got to point to real harms before you go out there and break up our most successful companies. Sorry. On the right, it's just this crazy idea that they're just trying to muzzle conservatives that you hear. I don't think that's really the case. The people they're trying to muzzle are nuts who are calling for violence and anti-Semitism and racism and terrorist groups that are trying to organize online and all sorts of dark forces that ought to be kept under wraps, if you ask me.
One of the Becky made a really good point about your organization's perspective and your perspective on kind of the political landscape. We're coming into surprising how quickly we are already focused on the presidential race and coming into 2024. Give from your perspective the dynamics of the 2024 election cycle, and also if you could maybe piggyback a little bit on that and talk about what you think a winning message looks like for working families here in America.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great question. I'm trying to write on that today, so try this out on you. But I think it's a fascinating campaign that's taken shape here. But it's too much about what happened last time, right? 2020. Yeah. So 2020, the aftermath of the 2020 election seems to be dominating this new election cycle in two ways. First, Donald Trump's running again, right? Against, contrary to a lot of predictions, prominent Republicans who said, okay, he's finished after this January 6th stuff. But he apparently isn't finished and is the clear front runner for the Republican nomination again. But the other side, the other reason that the old elections dominating the new one is that his reckoning with the legal system is catching up with him. So now, you've got all these investigations, indictments cascading down on him. And I'm pretty sure that the Jack Smith, the Department of Justice special prosecutor, is going to bring charges very soon against President Trump and some of his enablers over the events of January 6th and the broader campaign to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power and file phony slates of electors and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's going to happen. And so that's an unprecedented thing. We'll be talking about in the 24 race about a Republican frontrunner who could very well be charged and convicted of crimes in this election cycle. Now,
Yep.
no one, no, it's, actually, we have had presidential candidates who campaigned from jail before. Eugene Debs back in 1912 did that. But we'll see if that happens this time. But I just cannot believe that that's going to help him with the general electorate. It might help him with his hardcore base that thinks he can do no wrong. But I just got to feel that there's Republican women and suburbanites and the independents and many moderates out there on the landscape who aren't already committed, and even some working class folks who, some of whom have kind of gone back, some of who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. Biden made some inroads with those voters. I just can't believe that Trump will be helped by this, by a whole bunch of criminal charges and possibly even criminal convictions in the midst of a presidential election campaign.
And that goes to a topic that Becky and I've discussed a lot, is that Trump's arrival, or Trump's coming back into the presidential race, and as you correctly noted, is likely the front runner. It takes away from a substantive, I think, policy election, and it becomes more of a much more of a partisan personal dynamic. And I think that's frustrating to both Becky and I, as she's certainly more Republican, would identify more as a Republican than I do. As I said earlier, I'm kind of a homeless Republican, and I think that's what's going to be unfortunate about a Trump Biden race, is that I think it's going to be a very nasty race. And because of the pending legal issues that Trump is facing, I think that takes away from a substantive policy. And I wanted to follow up with you on that. For working families and a whole variety of issues this cycle, what does a message, do you think, fit in and help, because I don't think the vast majority of Americans who are going to be voting are going to be interested, Trump's legal issues, I don't think is going to be front and center on their decision to vote this cycle. But economic issues and a message for working families, where do you think that message lands this election cycle?
It's a good question. It's hard for me to know because, if Trump is the front runner, he really doesn't talk too much about that. His thing is he's going to rearrange the federal government. He's going to agglomerate power in the White House. He's going to go back to Richard Nixon's old imperial presidency and take powers away from Congress and the regulatory agencies. And he's also made explicit threats to use the Department of Justice and FBI to go after his political enemies. So, how do you get a real debate about the economic questions that are on people's minds and other questions in a context in which that kind of revenge motive is so strong on his side? Now, maybe he won't get the nomination, but we'll see. He ran on an economic message that was as dark as anybody's, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Tombstones littering the American landscape, those shuttered factories, and how the elites sold us out, and all the trade agreements ruined our industrial economy. And none of it was really true. And these big these tariffs that didn't do us any good made him feel better, maybe. So I don't know what the Republican economic message is. I know what Biden's is. Biden is going to say that we finally got a builder's liberalism again. We're finally investing in America again. We're going to rebuild a modern infrastructure under our economy, which is a good thing. It's, Trump couldn't get it done in 4 years. His predecessors didn't either, but we finally got a big investment in modernizing our basic economic infrastructure. And this, we're going to speed up this clean energy transition, and we're going to try to make sure we don't get left behind in the competition for, electric cars. And Chinese are already ahead of us on that. We got to catch up. So I think there is, this idea of playing catch up a little bit. Economic catch up is going to be something you're going to hear from Democrats, and they're saying that they're willing to, to make the public investments, and they're willing to use government in a more assertive way to make sure that we are developing the kind of capacities we need to be competitive for the rest of the century. vis-a-vis China. So I do think that's going to be a centerpiece of it. But honestly, I don't know what the Republican message is going to be, because it depends, because somebody else, it'll have to be somebody from Trump that delivers a new one, and I don't know if you'll get that.
I don't know that Republicans know what Republicans' message is going to be, to be perfectly honest.
That's interesting. Well, Will, we want to thank you so much for joining us today, and hope that there's an opportunity. I think Becky and I both identified a lot with what you said. I think our listeners will too. And I hope that as we get, there's opportunities for you to come back, particularly next election cycle, and we get close to the election, offer more insight and analysis on where you think the race is shaping up, particularly to your views and your organization views. But I just really thank you for being here today.
We want to thank you for listening to this bonus episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. Again, the website is bbreakpod.com. You can find us on Twitter at bbreakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Have a great one.